Okay, we are going to start. We have today Antonio Marín-Franch from the AC, so he's working here. But before, although he did the PhD here, then he moved to Florida, where he was working there for 3 years or so. Yeah. And then he's currently here working under Juan de la Cierva grant. No? So today he's going to speak about relative ages in galactic globular clusters. So please go ahead.
Thank you. So yeah, I'm presenting our latest results on galactic globular clusters, relative ages, and then I'll discuss those results in the context on the Milky Way formation timescale. This work is part of a big collaboration with a bunch of people from the United States, Italy, and here from the AEC. And this is the outline of today's talk. Start with a brief introduction to the ages problem. I'll talk about the literature, the context of relative ages studies, and why we study ages in globular clusters. Then I'll present our database. Then next part is the technical part of the talk, where I present, how I work with globular clusters and how I determine the relative ages. Then I'll present the results and the discussion. So why study globular cluster ages? So globular clusters are very interesting because are the oldest objects for which reliable ages can be measured. So if we focus on absolute ages of globular clusters, we can get an estimation, a lower limit of the age of the galaxy and the age of the universe. But if we focus on the relative ages, we can obtain valuable information about the galaxy formation mechanisms and timescales. So today we are focusing on relative ages, and as I'll show later, you can see that relative ages can be determined with precision by measuring the position of the main sequence turn-off relative to different features in the color magnitude diagram. Those are the two traditional methods measuring relative ages. First one is the horizontal method, where you measuring the difference in color between the main sequence turn-off, which is here, relative to a fixed point on the RGB. You can get an estimation of the globular cluster age. Similar thing, but the vertical method, you can determine relative ages by measuring the difference in brightness between the horizontal branch and the turn-off. So the horizontal method is technically is pretty easy. You can determine the color of the turn-off pretty easy, and you can find this color difference. But from the theoretical point of view, it's tricky because it depends a lot on some assumptions you do on the theoretical models, in particular on the temperature to color transformation. So results using the horizontal method usually depends on the theoretical model you are using. On the contrary, the vertical method is theoretically more robust, but sometimes the determination of the horizontal branch is very difficult, in particular with high metallicity clusters. So relative ages studies have point towards a scenario in which the metal-poor globular clusters are largely coeval, and the age dispersion with metal increases at high metallicity. You can see here different studies, and of course you see here that all low metallicity clusters are largely coeval, and with increasing metallicity you get an increase in the age dispersion. Here I'm showing in blue points works that are based on literature compilation of color magnitude diagrams, while the red points show the studies with homogeneous globular cluster photometry. So what we have learned from those studies is that having a homogeneous globular cluster photometry is a key point. You need a homogeneous database. So this is the point to present our database. This work is part of the ACS survey of galactic globular clusters, we have observed using the ACS wide field camera for surveys on board the HST. We observed 65 globular clusters. You can see here the spatial distribution of globular clusters in the galaxy. We are limited ourselves to low reddening globular clusters. That's why we have a lack, if this is not working, yeah, a lack of clusters in this part of the galaxy. So the observation and the data reduction pipelines produce around 12 magnitudes of precise photometry. It is worth mentioning that we are covering the whole metallicity interval, and we are observing clusters at a galactocentric distance smaller than 20 kiloparsecs. I'm showing here, I said, a few color magnitude diagrams, so you can you can see, I mean, how good the photometry and the quality of the data we are working with. And you can see that main sequences are very well defined, several magnitudes fainter than the turn-off. So this is the first time that the main sequence can be used to determine relative ages. So in this work we will use, instead a vertical or horizontal method I presented before, we are using an alternative approach, and we will use the main sequence to determine the relative ages. So before going to the detail of how do we determine ages, we need to go from the color magnitude diagram to a well-defined fiducial sequence representing each cluster. So that is something like that. So we observe color magnitude diagrams, but we need to have, to determine a well-defined, well-measured sequence to compare clusters. So how do we do that? We use a two-steps procedure. In the first step, we connect the maximum of several color histograms, as is shown here in the picture, and then we use this preliminary fiducial to determine the final fiducial, but in this case using rotated histograms, rotated in the way that they are perpendicular to the sequence. So you can see here how the peak of the histogram is much better defined in the rotated. I'm not using that anymore, it's not working well. So you can see here how the peak is much better defined. So it's worth mentioning that in case of having clusters with multiple stellar populations, like this case, this is 1851, we have here the double subgiant branch. So in case of having multiple stellar populations, this method fits the dominant one. So using this procedure to determine the globular cluster fiducials, we finally get a fiducial for every cluster, and then we can determine with precision the turn-off position in every case. So we are now ready to proceed with the main sequence fitting, but before doing that, let me introduce the theoretical background problem. So I'm showing here a set of 6 isochrones using the Dotter et al. Stellar evolution library. So I'm plotting isochrones with the same metallicity and varying the age that way. So you can see here how the position of the turn-off varies with age. So if I plot those points in a graph like that, where I'm showing the magnitude of the main sequence turn-off against metallicity, I get something like that. Now if I repeat the process but varying the metallicity, I can obtain a grid like that, where solid lines represent kind of isochrones, lines with the same age from 15 to 6 gigayears. I repeated the same theoretical calibration, let me say that, using 4 different stellar evolution libraries. So before continuing, let me notice that. So we can find here those 2 regions which are color magnitude features that have little or no dependence with age. So those 2 regions are the regions I'm going to use to do the relative main sequence fitting from cluster to cluster. That is, I'm doing something like that. I use a reference cluster, then I'll shift both in color and magnitude the target cluster till I get the best fit in the 2 regions I have here. So that way, it's not a problem having clusters at different distances or with different extinction. Once the main sequence fitting is done, I get the relative brightness or the difference in the turn-off magnitude. And this difference is what I'm going to use to derive relative ages. So let me show a few examples. Those are fiducials from our globular cluster database. You can see that from here I can get the relative positions of the turn-off from cluster to cluster. The red one is the reference cluster, is the same in all the fits, and the blue lines represent the fiducials or clusters with similar metallicity. So I can go to a plot similar to the one I showed before, and I plotting here the delta, or the difference in magnitude, the turn-off magnitude from every cluster regarding the reference one. So the main sequence fitting works perfectly well if you have clusters with the same metallicity. But the main sequence varies with metallicity. It varies a lot in the Hubble metallicity range. But we found that the variation is small if you limit yourself to metallicity groups. I'm showing here. It's not very clear, but I think you can see the colors represent different metallicity intervals. So I've repeated that main sequence fitting in all those 5 metallicity intervals, and once I have points, the same points in the adjacent metallicity intervals, I can use one cluster from each gap, from each interval, and do a relative main sequence between both of them. So that way I can obtain something like that. I can grow this number of points doing something like that. So at the end I get the whole database, the relative turn-off magnitudes for the whole database. Now, once I have that, I only need the distance and the reddening of one cluster to calibrate the whole database. So in this case, I'm using one of those, so I can transform those relative magnitudes to absolute magnitudes. And then once I'm here, I'm very close to the end because I just compare with the theoretical calibration I did a few slides before. So I can use now this plot to get ages of globular clusters. So I'm showing here a result of the relative ages of the whole globular cluster database we observed. In this case, one is I'm using the age of this low metallicity group, which is largely coeval. I get the normalizing age, and then I divide the age of every globular cluster by the mean age of this group. So that's why I'm showing. I get one from that thing, and those are younger globular clusters. So first thing, we find that again, similar to previous results, low metallicity clusters are largely coeval, and in principle we get an age dispersion when we move to higher metallicities. It is worth mentioning that this result is exactly the same when I use the other 3 stellar evolution libraries. So it is very robust. It doesn't depend on the stellar evolution library you use. So let me compare. This is the plot I showed in the introduction, but now let me add our points here. So here So what we see here is that instead of an increasing dispersion with age, we can find here like 2 groups of globular clusters. A group with all globular clusters with no age-metallicity relation, and when we move to higher metallicities, we find that branch here. So let's discuss those 2 groups in detail. So let's start with the old group, which is the old branch here, and let's discuss its age dispersion. So each group has the same age. It doesn't have an age-metallicity relation, and the intrinsic dispersion of points in this group is 0.4 gigayears. So what does it mean? It does mean that the whole group of clusters form within a fast assembling process of the galactic halo that lasts around 0.8 gigayears. And this is a conclusion. But before moving forward, let me play a little bit with those numbers, and let's estimate, for example, the free fall time of a homogeneous sphere with that mass and that radius, which are an estimation of the Milky Way halo with dark matter. And then the free-fall time of this sphere is around 0.8 gigayears. So we get the same time scale. This is not a proof that the part of the halo, that this group of all clusters formed in a single collapse. But the important thing is that it doesn't reject this option. Traditionally, the age dispersion of globular clusters has been used to reject the possibility of a collapse of a single big protosystem. So in this case, what we are concluding is that we cannot, according to the globular cluster age, we cannot reject this option. We are not rejecting either the hierarchical galactic formation mechanisms that are predicted in that cold dark matter scenario, but any successful galaxy formation scenario must account for the existence of a large number of old and coeval globular clusters. Let's move a little bit and then let's focus on these young branch of globular clusters, and then let's pay attention to its age-metallicity relation. So yeah, apparently there is a second branch. Let me play a little bit and overplot the globular clusters that are associated with the Sagittarius dwarf galaxy, and all of them populate this young branch. I can do the same thing with monoceros and canis majors. I know that there is controversy about canis majors and monoceros, but it's just, for testing. And you can see how all those clusters associated with monoceros and canis majors are also populating the young branch. I'm overplotting also globular clusters that are known to have multiple stellar populations, which have been populating here and two more here. But let's move on, and let me plot now globular clusters in blue, which are located at a galactocentric distance larger than 10 kiloparsecs. And no exception, in the high metallicity region, all of them are here. So accreted systems are expected to have more energetic orbits. So it's very tempting to connect both concepts. So conclusion, there is a young group of clusters with a clear age-metallicity relation that is being shown here, and the intrinsic dispersion of age with respect to this age-metallicity is again around 0.4 gigayears. So according to all that, those results are consistent with a scenario in which those young globular clusters form in a second phase, lasting much longer and resulting in a clear age-metallicity relation. According to all that, it's very tempting to connect this formation scenario with accretion of Milky Way satellites. Both populations have also different spatial distribution. Let me show you spatial distribution of populations, and I'm showing here the old population, which is much more concentrated, and the young population, which is more extended. So I think it's clear that there are two groups of globular clusters with a different formation process. So the conclusions are summarized here, and it is important to note that these results are independent on the theoretical model we have used. Those results are also independent on the metallicity scale we used. We found the existence of two different and very well-defined groups, the old group and the young group I talked about, and those results are consistent with a scenario, a galactic halo scenario that took place in two different phases. One produced in the old group of globular cluster, and the second phase where the young group were formed. The first phase is compatible with a fast assembling process of the galactic halo, so it was really, really fast. It couldn't be faster than that, by the way, because the time scale is comparable with it's more or less the same as the time scale of a monolithic collapse. So it couldn't be faster than that. And then there was a second phase that lasted much longer, and it's very tempting to suggest that this second phase is connected or related with accretion of Milky Way satellite galaxies. Thank you.
time for questions.
So, maybe one comment and one question. Okay. So according to your conclusions, it looks that your favorite scenario is, let's say, the monolithic collapse for the large amount of old clusters you are obtaining, okay, and then some sort of cosmetic, accretion, which is creating this younger clusters. Okay, I'm pretty happy with this anyway. But anyway, so this seems to be the case for major galaxies as well. Now, concerning the question, in order to be a little bit more convinced that the theoretical isochrones are not having any influence on the results you are obtaining for these two families, and I know that you don't want to talk about the absolute ages, but since the atomic diffusion takes effect on after, let's say, 9 or 10 gigayears, I would like to see whether the absolute ages that you obtain for the different isochrones, set of isochrones, are the same or are having differences, and what values are. That's very important, particularly with the teramo ones that include the atomic diffusion.
Yeah, you are right. I don't want to talk about absolute ages. But you're also right. The absolute ages prediction obtained with the 4 different theoretical models is different. There is a difference of around 1 gigayear from extreme to extreme. I'm not pretty sure which one is predicting younger and which one is predicting older ages. We can talk about that later. But it is true that the absolute age depends on the model. But what is very interesting, and I'm very happy with that, is that they are very consistent. They produce exactly the same results regarding relative ages. But yeah, if we want to focus on absolute ages, we are working on that in a forthcoming paper. We need to think a little bit more because there is a model dependency there. So.
But your values are above 10 gigayears, let's say.
Yeah. The old population is around 13 gigayears. In particular, using the Dotter et al. Isochrones is 12.8 gigayears for the old population, the mean age of the old population.
So the atomic diffusion phenomenon is taking place.
Thank you.
I have another question. One of the reasons why the monolithic collapse was rejected as a formation scenario for the Milky Way was that under that assumption you should expect a very nice correlation between the metallicity of the globular clusters and their distances to the center of the galaxy, in the sense that the clusters in the center should be more metal-rich, right? Have you checked if with this new, by splitting the globular clusters in the two families, the situations gets better, in the sense that have you checked if all globular clusters follow a metallicity relationship with respect to the distance to the center of the galaxy? Or?
I thought I had a slide ready for that question, but I was wrong. I paid attention to the distribution, to the metallicity relation with galactocentric distance for the whole database. I didn't split that in the both subgroups we find here. But yeah, you find that metal-rich globular clusters tend to be closer to the galaxy center. But I didn't check that, taking into account the two populations separately. But that means that I'm not defending the monolithic collapse. I'm just saying that those results are compatible with the monolithic collapse, which is different from the scenario 2 years ago, where the monolithic collapse was rejected using relative ages. So I'm telling that you cannot reject that scenario using relative ages. And the collapse, if that was the problem, to metal the galaxy. But I didn't check that for the two populations separately.
More questions?
I think that you have mentioned, but maybe I have missed, and I don't know, how do you relate the relative ages of different groups of metallicity? Because you have a reference in age group, but in order to connect one group with the other, how do you connect?
I do exactly the same thing. I do a relative main sequence fitting between one cluster in each different group. So imagine I have the two clouds of points where I do the main sequence fitting inside each subgroup, but I don't know how to connect two consecutive groups. So I take one well-defined cluster inside each group, so the difference in metallicity is low enough to make possible this fitting. So this fitting is pretty good, and the uncertainties in this fitting is represented in the error bars I just showed. And then using those two reference clusters, I do a main sequence fitting between the relative, the two reference clusters. That way I match the two groups.
But you assume that in each of the group, this reference cluster is really at the H1 or in the 0 level?
No,
so
I don't
how do you relate one reference cluster with the other reference cluster in a different group?
I do the main sequence fitting, and I obtain the difference in the magnitude of the turn-off between two reference clusters in two different groups. And then, as I know the difference of magnitude and the turn-off magnitudes inside each group, then I can connect everything. So I don't know if I'm being clear. So I don't need to assume anything. I just do the main sequence fitting and then obtain the difference in magnitude between the reference cluster in group A and reference cluster in group B. So I know now this delta magnitude. And as I know all the relative magnitudes inside each group, then I know the relative magnitudes inside the whole sample.
Because I had the same I had the same question as he had, and I think so I can ask a more detailed question. I think what you do actually is to take like the most metal-rich cluster of the metal poor of one metal poor and the more metal poor of the metal-rich part, and so you have two clusters which are very close in metallicity, right?
I can do that. I'm not doing that at the end, but I can do that.
But how can you then? I mean, I see the same problem as he's seeing. I mean, how can you relate?
The metallicity difference is.
Representative cluster in two aspects without a problem, using the same procedure as for the rest of the cluster.
Thank you.
I have two questions for you. The first one is how many globular clusters in your sample show two or more stellar populations? And in case you find two or more stellar populations within a cluster, what is the impact of these two or more populations on your results? I mean, you mentioned that your method works very well for the most, identifies very well the most dominant stellar population, but what if there are two populations that appear to be dominant?
This is not the case for any of our clusters. So there are 5 clusters with known multiple stellar populations in the sample, but it doesn't mean that I detect in 5 clusters multiple sequences. So I detect multiple sequences clearly only in one cluster, and it's not that clear in 2 more. So in the extreme case is the one I showed when I was talking about the procedure of fitting the fiducial, is 1851, where you can see the 2 populations. So this is the extreme case I found in the sample, and in that case we fit the dominant one. So when we are talking about relative ages of that cluster, we are talking about the relative ages of that subpopulation, which is the dominant one in that cluster. But this is the case only in one. In that case, it's a little bit older. But The dominant population is a little bit younger. So the other population has a fainter subgiant branch, so it's around a giga-year older than the dominant one. Antonio is...
The differences in the main in the turn of main sequence in such case is produced rather by differences in chemical composition rather than in age. Probably all the population has the same or very similar age, but the main difference is introduced by differences in the chemical composition. In helium, in particular, for example, helium produces in omega sen. The difference of the several population present are produced by differences in helium.
And this result comes in the wake of several previous studies who have done classifications of the globular cluster system and found initially, if I'm not mistaken, two classes. It was kind of the metal rich, that was called a disky system, subsystem, and then the halo, metal poor halo. I think afterwards there was a classification in 3 groups, and now you seem to be going down to 2 groups. So my question would be, the metal rich part, does it correspond to that metal, the class of metal-rich objects that have kind of disky kinematics that are close to the plane of the Milky Way?
Mm-hmm. That's a very good question, and I was looking for trying to connect the spatial distribution of the young branch of globular clusters with the superplane of dwarf galaxies. It's more or less, dwarf galaxies in the galaxy neighborhood tend to be located more or less or predominantly around a plane. So I was trying with this aim, trying to look if I would find a special 3D distribution of these clusters, but I didn't find anything. So both of them are well mixed. So I didn't find that the young or metal-rich cluster were in a different 3D distribution than the old ones.
But they are not then confined to more or less to the plane of the Milky Way?
No, I didn't find that.
So the 3D distribution is
more or less homogeneous at first approach. Probably we need more clusters or extend to the outer halo to find a 3D distribution different. Apart from the distance to the center of the galaxy, but looking for structures, I didn't find that with this database.
Do you have information on the kinematics? Can you find? Are there proper motions for this?
I haven't looked for information in the kinematics. That would also provide us a valuable piece of information in that sense. Yeah, we can try to work on that. This is part of a big project. There is a team working on kinematics, but I'm not part of this specific project.
Can you resolve the binary sequence in your clusters?
In the binary sequence, yeah.
Do you have any information on the evolution as a function of mass?
I'm not the one working in binaries in globular clusters. There is a group led by people in Italy, in Padova, which are working in binary content of globular clusters. So I can see the sequence, but I'm not working on that. This is a huge amount of data, and we are 17 people working on that, so we try to distribute the work. So I can, as soon as we have a paper, I can send you the link.
Been reading the draft this weekend. I think that there is no relation between the differences in the binaries population and this kind of things. I don't remember anything related to that. We are looking for relations between the binary populations and the internal parameters of the cluster, rather. We could do a meeting, one of these talks in 1 or 2 months from now.
You're really welcome. Any other question? Well, I have 2. So, so if the all clusters are coming, let's say, from a primordial gas or whatever, why they have so many different metallicities? So you would not expect to find them. I mean, when you saw metallicity versus age there, there was like so you find old and young cluster with the full range of metallicity. So you would not expect to find all clusters more focused to lower metallicity? It
depends on the metal enrichment process. So what we find is we find that the old population, we have clusters with, as you see, of all metallicities. And the metallicity tend to increase when you go to the center of the galaxy. So there was a metallicity enrichment that was really, really very fast.
After the formation of the globular cluster?
During the formation process of that old population.
And the second question is, I wasn't able to follow your connection between the monolithic collapse of a big mass of 10 to the 12 solar masses and the dispersion age of the globular cluster, because one is related to the formation of a big massive halo, let's say, and the other one is the formation of in small scales. So why they both should be connected at all? So you form globular cluster probably before the collapse of the galaxy, no?
This is kind of a simplistic galaxy formation process, where you have that big proto-system, big proto-galactic cloud that starts to collapse, and during the collapse it starts to form stars and globular clusters. So during the collapse, both globular clusters and the halo stars are forming. So this is kind of simplistic in the sense of Egan, Lindelbell and Sandage 62 galaxy formation process. This is kind of simplistic, but this is the connection between. This is what, just for playing. I mean, I try to compare the time scales of this simplistic model and our dispersion of globular clusters. So in the context of such a formation scenario.
No further questions? If not, let's thank the speaker again.